The ship arrived without warning. No trumpets, no ceremony. A fleet of dark-hulled vessels slid into the harbor at Malacca sometime in the early 16th century, and the Portuguese traders watching from the docks felt something shift in their chests. Not fear exactly, but the particular unease of men who suddenly realize they are not the most powerful people in the room. Incidentally, the merchants on those ships spoke Tagalog, Visayan, and at least 3 other languages fluently. They carried silk, gold, beeswax, and porcelain. They carried something else, too. A reputation that had traveled ahead of them across the whole of maritime Southeast Asia. A reputation built not over decades, but over centuries of trade, so sophisticated it would take European scholarship another 400 years to fully acknowledge it. This is the story of what the Philippines was before anyone decided what the Philippines should be. Forget the image of isolated island villages. Forget the barefoot fishermen waiting to be civilized. The archipelago that would later bear a Spanish king's name was, long before any European compass pointed east, the commercial spine of a world trade network stretching from the Chinese coast to the Arabian Peninsula. Filipino merchants didn't stumble into this network. They built significant portions of it. Here's where the Vatican enters the picture, and then the story gets strange. Rome in the early 16th century was obsessed with cartography. Papal cartographers were drafting maps of the world with the anxious energy of men who knew that whoever named a place first owned it. The 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas had already sliced the globe between Spain and Portugal like a melon, and the Church had blessed the blade. Control of trade routes meant control of the known world. Control of the known world meant control of souls. Control of souls meant gold. The problem was the maps kept being wrong, not slightly wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Islands appeared where there were none. Coastlines bent in impossible directions. The Philippine archipelago, like 7,000 islands scattered like broken glass across the Pacific, kept refusing to fit neatly into European geographical imagination. And the reason the maps were wrong is the reason this story matters. Europeans were mapping a world where Filipino merchants had already been operating for generations. Pause here. To understand what that means, you need to understand what Butuan was. Butuan sits on the northeastern coast of Mindanao. Today it's a city famous for its excavated boat coffins and its gold. In the year 1001, long before any crusader had reached Jerusalem, and a full 5 centuries before Magellan would claim to have discovered anything, the ruler of Butuan sent a diplomatic mission to the Song dynasty court in China. The mission wasn't a beggar's appeal, it was a trade negotiation between equals. Butuan's exports, abaca rope, forest resins, beeswax, were luxury goods in China, not curiosities. The Song court records describe the Butuan envoy as representing a kingdom with its own coinage, its own legal system, and its own established merchant class. Not a tribe, a kingdom. There's a catch. The gold of Butuan wasn't decorative, it was functional. Archaeologists digging at the Libertad site in the 1970s pulled from the earth a collection of gold artifacts so dense and so technically accomplished. Gold thread, carat purity testing equipment, weights and measures, that the immediate scholarly assumption was that someone must have traded for them from elsewhere. That assumption was wrong. The metallurgy was local, the tradition was local, the sophistication was local. Stop for a second. Filipino goldsmiths were testing karat purity with standardized equipment at a time when most of Europe was still debating whether the earth was round. That's not a metaphor. That's a dating problem. The tools and the techniques predate the conventional European contact period by centuries. Now return to Rome. When Magellan's surviving ship, the Victoria, limped back to Spain in 1522, completing the first circumnavigation of the earth, it carried something more valuable than spices. It carried testimony. The ship's logs, and particularly the account written by Antonio Pigafetta, describe the Philippine archipelago not as wilderness, but as a functioning commercial civilization. Pigafetta recorded kings who received gifts with diplomatic restraint and offered gifts in return with calculated generosity. He recorded merchants who weighed goods on precision scales. He recorded gold so common, it was used for everyday ornamentation. The Vatican read these reports. To be honest, what happened next is where the word erasure becomes precise rather than dramatic. There's a catch. The papal response to the circumnavigation wasn't wonder. It was territorial anxiety. If the Philippines existed as a sophisticated trading civilization with established diplomatic relationships across Asia, with China, with the Sultanate of Brunei, with the Mahapahit sphere, then the Church's claim to spiritual jurisdiction over pagan lands required a more careful argument. You cannot simply declare dominion over people who already have kings, laws, and accounting systems. So the framing shifted. On the other hand, the official narrative that emerged gradually across papal documents and colonial edicts described the archipelago's peoples as fragmented, unorganized, spiritually lost. The word barangay was recast from its original meaning, a prosperous coastal trading vessel and the community organized around it, into something smaller, something local, something that didn't suggest a network. That reframing had consequences. When Spanish colonial authorities arrived and demanded tribute, the gold paid by Filipino communities wasn't framed as diplomatic exchange between trading partners. It was framed as submission. The language changed the meaning. The meaning changed the history. Well, incidentally, the gold reached Rome. Important, the amount was significant. The documentation called it tribute. The people paying it had called it something different. And that difference, buried under 5 centuries of colonial paperwork, is what historians today are slowly excavating. But here's the thread that pulls everything loose. In the early 17th century, a Jesuit scholar named Pedro Chirino wrote a detailed account of Philippine civilization. Chirino had learned Tagalog. He had read the indigenous script Bibayan fluently enough to recognize that it carried a sophisticated literary tradition. His account described a society with complex inheritance laws, formalized debt systems, and a merchant class that operated on contracts enforced by community reputation rather than state violence. Chirino's account was published. It circulated. Then, for reasons that scholarly consensus attributes to the politics of colonial administration rather than any single conspiracy, the more inconvenient details quietly disappeared from the summaries and abstracts that later historians used as source material. Not burned, not banned. Quietly not cited. That's how erasure actually works. Not in flames, in footnotes. The traders of the Visayas, the merchants of Manila Bay, the gold weighers of Butuan, they didn't vanish from history because someone destroyed the evidence. They vanished because the evidence was consistently placed in the category of curiosity rather than foundation. And foundations require reckoning. Here is what a reckoning looks like. In 2021, the National Museum of the Philippines reclassified a significant portion of its pre-colonial gold collection under updated provenance research that directly challenged the old trade import assumptions. Filipino researchers, not foreign archaeologists, led that reclassification. It received almost no international press. But there's a detail. The Philippine Arab trade, documented in Chinese records from the 9th century onward, shows that Filipino merchants were navigating to what is now Oman and Yemen, with enough regularity that Arab geographers included Philippine islands in their own trading maps. Their own maps, centuries before any European cartographer tried. Think about that geometry. A Filipino sailor in the 9th century knew the route to Arabia by the stars. He knew the seasonal winds. He knew the currency exchange rates at every major port along the way. He came home and he came back. He wasn't an anomaly, he was a profession. On the other hand, the Vatican paid in gold because gold was the language Filipino merchants spoke fluently. When Spanish authorities structured the colonial tribute system, they denominated it in gold because that's what the existing economy already ran on. They didn't introduce gold valuation to the Philippines, they hijacked it. Now pay attention. The alliance, like if that word fits the complex web of diplomatic necessity and commercial pragmatism that tied Philippine polities to early European powers, was never Rome's to name. It was negotiated by people whose names weren't recorded in European documents because European clerks didn't know how to spell Baybayin syllables into Latin script. Some names survive anyway. Raja Humaban of Cebu, who received Magellan's fleet not as a conqueror but as a trading partner. Who converted to Christianity not in the stunned awe of the spiritually lost, but in the calculated pragmatism of a ruler who recognized a new geopolitical alliance when one arrived by ship. Who then, when the alliance failed to serve his interests, coordinated with Lapu-Lapu to end it decisively at the Battle of Mactan. Humaban wasn't a convert. He was a diplomat. The cross was a trade good. Lapu-Lapu wasn't a rebel. He was a sovereign. The distinction sounds small. It is not small. It is the difference between a history that begins with arrival and a history that was already in motion. That history is in the ground at autumn, in the Chinese imperial records, in the Arab trade maps, in Cigarette's journal, which is still readable, still available, still underutilized by the people whose ancestors it describes. This is what you can do right now, today, not as an abstraction, but as a specific act. Find the Nyala Museum's online archive of pre-colonial Philippine gold artifacts. Look at the Laguna Copperplate inscription, the oldest known written document found in the Philippines, dated 900 CE, written in a script related to Old Malay, recording a debt transaction. A debt transaction, not a myth, not a prayer, a business record. Read that record and understand what it means. The Philippines was literate, commercial, and diplomatically connected to the wider world when most of the European kingdoms that would later claim authority over it hadn't been founded yet. That's not pride dressed up as history. Now pay attention. That's history, full stop. The ships didn't arrive to bring civilization. They arrived into it. The gold Rome received wasn't tribute from the lost. It was payment extracted by force of arms, by legal fiction, by the long, slow alchemy of renaming, from people who had been weighing gold on precision scales for 500 years before anyone in Rome thought to look east. Important. The story was always there. The story was. It was waiting for someone to read it in the right language,